Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're here to talk about NRCS programs and how they can help you do habitat management on your properties. We have Toby Alexander and Travis Hart, and hopefully I'm going to be able to pin the third presenter, Felixia Moore, who is with NRCS, to the screen. And we'll be able to share about this program. I'm not going to talk too much about them. I will let them share about themselves. Toby is with NRCS. That's a federal program. And Travis is with Vermont Fish and Wildlife as habitat biologist, and he's the one who can help you do the on-the-ground stuff. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Toby and Travis, and tell us all about these great things we can use to get habitat work done on our properties.
Okay. Can we see?
It looked good, Toby.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I'm Toby Alexander. I'm the state biologist and forester for NRCS in Vermont, and I'll be starting out. We're going to switch off kind of through the presentation between myself and Travis, and Felixia, I think, will finish us up. So we'll get started. So today we're going to go over a little bit about NRCS, what resource concerns are. That's kind of a strange term that some people may not have heard before. And we're going to hit on a few of the key programs we see for forest landowners in the state. We'll try to kind of compare and contrast the similarities, differences between practices and enhancements. We'll talk a bit more about that. Those are our ways we get conservation on the ground. And then some kind of newer information about climate smart activities and how best to get assistance. So for folks that don't know who NRCS is, we're the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We started out in the Dust Bowl times in the 30s as a soil erosion service, so going on 90 years in private lands work. So basically, we're one of the lead federal agencies for working with private landowners, helping them with conservation on their agricultural and forest lands. And we're responsible for implementing Farm Bill conservation programs. And we'll be talking about two of those today. And there's two parts to our assistance. There's technical assistance. That's the time that is spent out with the landowner, time that we have the partners like Fish and Wildlife Department come out as well. That's technical assistance. And financial assistance is the actual funds that go towards conservation on the ground through those practices and enhancements, and stewardship payments through the CSP program. So those are all financial assistance that landowners in Vermont are eligible for. And these programs are all available across the United States, fairly similar. A little bit of differences between the states, but these programs are offered throughout the country. So some of the partnerships that we have a lot of partnerships in Vermont. I'm going to focus on a little bit about the ones that have to do with wildlife habitat, fisheries habitat management, as well as forestry. So we've had an agreement with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department since about 2004. And the intent with this agreement is to provide some assistance to our field office staff in planning, designing, laying out, and certifying our conservation practices for habitat management out in the field. Traditionally, a lot of our folks haven't had that background, so we saw a good opportunity to work with our partners at Vermont Fish and Wildlife that had that expertise. Similarly, we work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a private lands program as well in the state, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and we partner with them on some of our other programs I won't be talking about today as much, like the CREP program, which is a buffer program on agricultural land, and also on our wetland reserve easement program, which is for restoration of wetlands and provides easement payments as well. Any questions about any of these programs, you can contact me later if I don't talk about all of them today. We do have quite a bit. National Wild Turkey Federation, we actually have had a forester on staff for the last 4 years. We've had some turnover, but currently our National Wild Turkey Federation forester is Spencer Como, and he's out of the White River Junction office, or excuse me, Rutland field office, but covers a lot of the southern part of the state. We also have an agreement with the Rough Grouse Society through our Working Lands for Wildlife, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's Luke McNally, and he works in the Champlain Valley primarily. We also work with Vermont Agency of Agriculture. They provide enhancement payments through the CRP program to provide additional payments to landowners on buffers, taking agricultural land out of production and improving habitat and water quality. Then, of course, natural resources conservation districts. We wouldn't be in our local offices without their sponsorship and having us invited to these areas. And then Vermont Forests and Parks, we had an agreement with them in the past. It's since we don't have it anymore, but we still work closely with them on a lot of our forestry issues in the state. So a little bit about conservation planning. So NRCS has a lot of different resource professionals. And I'm on a resource staff with others that include agronomists, grading specialists, cultural resources specialists, wetland specialists, soil scientists. So we have a lot of different expertise on staff here. And then we also have engineering. And then we have all the soil conservationists and local conservationists in our field offices that work with the landowners one-on-one. And they're the ones that are that interface with the landowner. And they're located across the whole state. And at the end of the slide presentation, we have kind of the locations of all our field offices where you can get assistance. All the work really begins and is captured with a conservation plan. So we have a really important process we call conservation planning process. And that includes identifying resource concerns. Those are kind of environmental problems that we might be able to fix on the land. The landowner's objectives, of course, it's like a forest management plan. We want to see what is most important to the landowners, what they want to accomplish, and then also determining what alternatives we might be able to go through, offer to get to that goals and objectives of that landowner and see which one is the best fit. And then, of course, the conservation practices are the method for addressing some of those resource concerns we see out on the landscape. So again, with the resource concerns, I just wanted to touch on this briefly because I know this term has confused some folks in the past. But really, it's really just an environmental issue that a landowner may have. And these are some of the more common ones that we run across for folks that are interested in wildlife habitat management and have forest land as well. Upper left-hand corner, inadequate habitat can mean a lot of things. You know, in this case, I'm just showing a picture of some ground nesting birds. So delay mowing on hay fields that are suitable for grassland birds, remove that threat to those species. Management is the most important aspect for grassland birds, is changing that mowing regime. Invasive plants, they have a lot of negative effects across the forest and idle lands. Inhibiting recreation and also inhibiting regeneration of forests, degrading habitat. So these are all things that we consider resource concerns that could be addressed with our practices. Plant productivity and health, that's another one in forest setting or other settings, but for this group, I'm going to be talking about forestry a bit. So when you have overstocked stands, you may have a lot of diseased, dying stems out there. They're overstocked. That could be a plant productivity and health issue that we can help address through thinnings. Soil erosion, folks may have soil erosion on some of their skid trails, and that's something that we can help address as well, because that's going to lead to further erosion and water quality problems. But differently than what you might see in an agricultural operation, the bottom left-hand corner, where we have water quality issues. It may not just be sediment, maybe nutrients as well from the animals. And so that's something we can help assist landowners with, is giving managed access, planting buffers, providing alternative watering sources for those animals. So a variety of different things we can do in that situation. So those are the resource concerns that I just kind of highlighted as an example. So the two major programs we're going to be talking about today, I think, that are most applicable are the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and this Conservation Stewardship Program. So the Environmental Quality Incentives Program provides that technical and financial assistance for conservation practices to address those concerns. And financial assistance is a set payment for each practice, and it's paid through this contract that NRCS has with the landowner. And folks should know that while it's intended that we pay most of the cost of these practices, they're not always paying the full amount, and it was never intended to pay the full amount. In some cases it may, in some cases it may not. It's a set payment that we don't have a lot of control of, actually. And EQIP, really, the big take home here for EQIP is it's best for properties that need a lot of improvements. So if you've never worked with NRCS and you haven't done a lot of active management on your woodlot and your land, EQIP may be a good way to go initially, because it's the most efficient and most cost-effective way to address numerous resource concerns or large extensive resource concerns. Now, for folks that have already done a lot of work on their own, they've maybe controlled invasive plants, they've done some habitat work, they're really just kind of doing above and beyond stuff now. Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, may be a good fit. Oftentimes, forest landowners, when they're working with us, kind of go through a progression. They first address a lot of their concerns that they have on their property through EQIP, with the conservation practices that pay a good rate, and then can move on to CSP when stuff is mostly in order and they may just want to do a bit extra to their land. So it's for those, CSP was always intended to be a green payment. It's for those people that are good stewards, have done work on their own or through working with us in the past. And it's going to reward them for that work and give them future incentives to do more work, actually. There's an annual payment for maintaining that level of conservation that they have at the time of application. And they use enhancements primarily. You can use practices as well, but enhancements are used to improve that conservation on those CSP lands. So what's the difference? So with CSP being used more now, we have enhancements now. Those are only available through CSP, but both conservation practices and enhancements are considered activities. So you'll hear that term, conservation activities. That can mean both enhancements or practices. So a conservation practice is a structural or vegetative measure or management used to address a resource concern. So an example of a structural practice would be a waste storage facility, where we're pouring a concrete pit for a farmer or something. Vegetative measure could be planting trees or a buffer. And management could be doing early successional habitat, where you're delaying mowing or you're creating a complex old field setting with different kind of mowing regime. So that's just an example of different types of practices. So the conservation practice standards are the guiding technical documents behind all these conservation practices. And there's real set guidelines about how they're to be implemented and what makes up a practice. So the enhancements are management activities that are tend to go above and beyond the minimum requirements of a practice. So that helps that producer achieve a higher level of conservation. And there are enhancement guide sheets that document these requirements. A good way to think about it is thinking about a good example is a riparian forest buffer. So our practice standard requires a 35-foot wide buffer on a stream. That kind of meets all the needs for the general criteria. If a landowner wants to have a wider buffer, they're more interested in wildlife habitat, there's an enhancement for that, increase riparian forest buffer width to enhance wildlife habitat. So that's an option. There's various options through these enhancements through CSP to do increases above and beyond or improvements above and beyond our minimum requirements of our practices. So if folks are interested and they want to try to find and look at some of these practices and enhancements, you can go to our field office technical guide. If you Google field office technical guide, Vermont, you can get to the general field office technical guide, and you just pick the state, and then you're going to look for section 4 on the left-hand side. Really, it's mostly, I would say mostly it's a good folder structure for our staff and us to maintain all our technical documents. There is some program information in there as well, but you're welcome to look at that as well. The enhancement guide sheets for all of our enhancements are on a website that I've put right here on the right-hand side, and you can Google that as well. Just Google NRCS enhancements, and you'll find this webpage, and it has all those different options for you to look at. So a little bit more about EQIP. Basically, it's one of our broadest programs. We can do lots of great forestry and wildlife work, but it's also a heavy lifter for agricultural operations as well. We do a lot of cover cropping, stream crossing work, working in grazing systems. Like I said, waste storage facilities, barnyards. Keeping dirty water from clean water. We work a lot on farms, and this is a major program for us on a lot of different ag sectors. On the forestry and wildlife side of things, really some of the big things we focus on are we offer forest management plans. And if we are applying a practice in forest land, we need to have a forest management plan in place. Landowners need a forest management plan in place. It does not need to be one of our NRCS funded forest management plans. If your forest management plan meets UVA standards, that's fine for EQIP eligibility to apply practices. So you don't need to worry about that. We do a lot of rare and declining species habitat prioritization. It's included in our ranking process for our projects. Aquatic and terrestrial habitat, pollinators, again, the plant health and vigor on our tree stands, invasive plants, and then of course, soil erosion and water quality. And EQIP is really about conservation practices. And I'm going to turn it over to Travis. He's going to step through some of our kind of major practices and habitats we focus on.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. So I'm Travis Hart, everybody. Just so you get an introduction, I with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. I work out of the Rutland office. I work on private and state lands. The private lands work that I do is mostly with NRCS, helping to facilitate EQIP and CSP programs. And I recognize a lot of your names, so some of you have already met me, but we're just going to go through quick some of these most common practices that we imply with EQIP and then we'll talk about CSP afterwards. Early successional habitat here is a big one. There's multiple different variations, but one of them is grassland. One of them being grassland bird management. This is usually delayed mowing. We're focused on those big areas, those big fields for those species like bobolink there in the center of the screen, creating those good grassland habitats where they can nest and raise and rear their young, delaying that mowing to a period that's long enough to meet those habitat requirements for their life cycle. Go ahead, Toby. Another one, early successional habitat is shrubland habitat. So kind of progressing here as far as different types goes. This is obviously leaving a little bit more of that shrubland areas for those shrubland birds, things like monarchs as well too, with a little bit more depth and structure to it. That's might not just be grassland, but it will have some of those small woody plants and others mixed in. This is kind of either maintaining or reclaiming these areas a lot of times. It can be through a variety of different ways, either brush hogging, tree cutting, some bits of mowing as well too in between a lot of times. But basically just creating enough of those clumps of the shrubland habitat and those old field characteristics mixed in amongst the grass to try to support some of these other birds like golden-winged warblers particularly, which is another one that we'll talk about with a specific program a little bit later as well. Go ahead, Toby.
It's locked up on me.
Oh no.
Did it work?
There we go. Last but certainly not least, for early successional habitat is our young forests work as well too. These are focused on cutting of low quality material in the woods, usually, well, always really. 2 acre minimums for these a lot of times. This is removal of 90% of that area to basically open up an area to a lot of sunlight, get a real big flush of growth, thousands and thousands of stems, usually improves cover, improves mast, or fruits and nuts for wildlife, as well as increasing insect biomass for birds. So you get things like chestnut-sided warbler, woodcock, bear, deer, just about everything. And these are going to be things that are more. This is going to be a type that's more in the woods, whereas the other two are going to be obviously in fields or on the edges of woods typically. Forest stand improvement is another one. Toby mentioned it briefly when we were talking about the general resource concerns, but the overall purpose of this is going to improve the forest health and productivity as well, mainly. It also improves habitat, opening some of those areas up as well too will provide more browse and other regeneration as well too. This is focused on pre-commercial or non-commercial work. where these are thinnings, crop trees that are designed to enhance the stand, but aren't ready yet to be commercially harvested. So the big differences being that thinnings are a target of basal area, whereas crops or crop tree or mass tree is targeting specific individual either timber production trees or mass producing trees for wildlife food. And then girdling is another option as well too in certain scenarios. Another version of forest stand improvement that we apply is timber/songbird habitat management. These usually involve kind of like small group selections, if you're familiar with any of those terms, but they're basically smaller scale versions of our early successional habitat mixed in amongst those those woods. To increase the vertical and the structural diversity in the forest, to create those different levels that the birds love to see, from the high canopy to some of those lower species in the mid level of the forest and ground cover as well too. And then there's variations of different ways to do a lot of these things. You can see on the left there, we have a girdle tree as well. A lot of times, at least it varies differently. It varies heavily depending on who you have available in your area for equipment. But there are mechanical options to do this. It's not all just done by hand. You can have a regular harvest come in from a logger. There's brontosaurus options to grind things down as well too. Lots of different mechanical options and hand options to do these types of work. Invasive plants are a big one, obviously. This is probably, I mean, I think you'd agree, Toby, this is probably one of our single biggest practices that we do every year, I feel like.
Most numerous, yep.
Exactly. Pretty much everywhere in Vermont, there's invasive plants of some sort. You can see a few of them on here with buckthorn and barberry and honeysuckle that Toby put in the background here. These really cause problems because they inhibit regeneration of a lot of our native plants that we'd rather have growing there. They degrade habitat. They don't typically have a lot of value beyond cover value sometimes if they're the only thing there. The fruits from these species typically are not very high in nutrition, and they don't provide much value to wildlife as well. So those combination of things are an important thing to prioritize this type of work. Plus all of the other types of things that we're trying to do in the forest, those young forest habitat, the forest stand improvement. If you've got invasive plants in there first and we open up sunlight to those, these take off and will dominate the area instead of getting the regeneration that you would rather have. And it's a long-term thing. Invasive plants don't just disappear overnight. They're a very difficult thing, even with the various methods of control that we have available to us. It still takes a long time and a lot of investment and maintenance. Forest trails and landings is another one Toby talked about with water quality and soil erosion earlier for the resource concerns. These are almost always going to be, in the woods at least, are going to be old forest roads, old skid roads, could potentially be some crossings as well too. But for the most part, this is going to be simple stuff in the woods that's, grading, creating or enhancing water bars that haven't been doing their job, or ditching as well too, where it makes sense. But mostly water barring, getting the water slowed down, spread off, and sinking down into the ground so that we don't cause that direct erosion and soil erosion and water quality issues further down the slope. Aquatic habitat. This one is a little bit more new and fresh in some instances. The past 5 or so years, we've been doing a little bit more with in-stream woody additions, which are putting purposeful additions of wood into streams for fish aquatic habitat. But this also is things like removing perched culverts to have better aquatic organism passage, maintaining good crossings for connectivity through those things as well too. So not something that's going to be fit on everybody's property, but an option there as well too, just to keep in mind. Tree and shrub planting, always another big one. We have riparian plantings. We have plantings for wildlife habitat, food cover, lots of different reasonings. But they address water quality or those habitat concerns primarily. And we develop a planting plan with the landowner to say, looking at soils, looking at what's missing in the area, what the primary purpose of that planting is, and trying to meet those goals, as well as any protections that might needed. Because if you're in Vermont, that deer will eat just about anything that you plant in the ground a lot of times. And then why don't you introduce this, Toby, quick?
Yep. Jumping back to the conservation stewardship program. So we just kind of stepped through all these different conservation practices, which are available through CSP. But just to keep in mind that through CSP, recognizing that it's intended to, do above and beyond and reward good management, pay for stewardship, it only pays a small fraction of the cost of the practices that Travis just kind of talked about. And that the whole point of that is if you've got a lot of practices that you need to do to address some major issues, then EQIP is probably a better fit. A lot of times it's going to pay a much higher rate. But CSP does pay a full rate for the enhancements, and it also offers a stewardship payment. So basically as we said, it takes that existing stewardship to a higher level with an additional activity. And really it's best suited for those that have already addressed a lot of resource concerns on their property. And it has an annual stewardship payment that is a nice addition to the reimbursement type payment for the enhancements. So CSP is relatively new in the Northeast. It's not new, but it's new to us. We just hadn't adopted it as quickly as some other parts of the country, but we're really making up for lost time, I think. So basically, the annual payments for existing stewardship on a CSP parcel is based upon the land use, number of resource concerns addressed at application time across their lands, number of land uses, and the acreage to be enrolled. So landowners must also agree to further conservation through an additional activity, a practice, or an enhancement on each land use to be included in the contract. So again, conservation practices are only paid at 10% of that cost. And so you're going to see the typical practice that through EQIP would have paid decently is going to be much lower through CSP, but the enhancements are paid at a normal rate, and some are quite generous, and especially the forest stand improvement ones are generous, I think. So the annual payments have increased significantly recently, and the minimum payment per year is $4,000. So for the 5-year contract, that's $20,000 as a minimum. So big change in the funds that are available through CSP. So I think Travis is going to step through some of these enhancements now for us. Thanks, Travis.
Yep. Yeah. Then thank you, Toby, for introducing that. And just to give folks, like, I'm going through these fairly fast just to give you a general overview as well too. These are all things that are much more fun to look at and talk about on the ground in the woods. If you have questions, obviously I'll answer those later as well too. But just know that I'm just giving you a general overview so you get a feel for how some of these things work. So for the enhancements, like Toby said, forest stand improvement or timber stand improvement, however you say that, are one of those things that have a fairly generous rate in CSP as well too, and are some of the most common things that we see folks doing for enhancements as well too. Crop tree management for mass production, very similar. It's very similar to our to the mass trees and other crop trees that I mentioned before. Not much different. Selecting specifically trees that produce high mass yields, and have value to wildlife as far as food sources go, things like oak, hickory, cherry, that type of thing. Snags, den trees, coarse woody debris is a really common one. This is creating additional snags and dropping whole logs on the ground to leave for coarse woody debris on the ground. Those stems that then cycle through and provide pathways for amphibians and other things as well too. It's another very common one that we do. Those are going to be in stands that are lacking those types of elements within them for habitat. And then another one, especially in the Champlain Valley, but potentially even more so across the entire state with our continuing list of growing endangered bats in the country, is summer roosting habitat for bat species. Currently we primarily use this in Champlain Valley for Indiana bats in a couple of instances, but that's involves more of opening up trees, getting sunlight on the bole or the trunk of that tree, to increase the overall potential roosting characteristics of that tree for bats and the attraction of that to bats. Go ahead, Toby. Structural diversity with patch openings. Again, very similar to our young forest and our timber songbird type at work, where we're opening, where we're creating young forest as well too. This might be on a slightly different scale, whereas you might just want to improve the diversity of the structure within the forest a little bit. You don't necessarily have a large area that you need that would make sense for young forest, that this could fit in that area. And then forest stand improvement to rehabilitate degraded hardwood stands is essentially our standard kind of timber stand improvement, thinning crop tree, just trying to improve those stands overall, get their health, productivity, and vigor on the right track. Okay, next. You freeze up again.
Yeah, a little bit.
Fun of presentations, everybody, right? On over the internet, and things like to be slow. There we go. Pollinator enhancements. So pollinators, I think Toby mentioned briefly, but pollinator habitat has been a big uptick in kind of interest and trying to get things done as well too on the ground. Everybody knows about bees and how important they are for the most part. So these are some of those things that help those, but also many of our other native pollinators. This can be cover for pollinators, so doing pollinator plantings, getting a wide variety, a mix of different flowering times of the year. So it might not just be herbaceous things; it could involve some small woody things as well too. Trying to get the whole suite of seasons from spring through to fall for pollinators and their use. Monarch butterfly habitat, that could be improving things more with milkweed and other aspects as well too. So just have a small bit of a different edge to it. And same thing with the field borders as well. Field borders are a little bit more for on the edges of agricultural use fields in some way, but the others could be in any instance, really. Lots of different things that we can do there. Tree and shrub planting, again, a lot of these are going to be very similar to the practices, but they just have a element that we're just enhancing things slightly. So that's increasing shading on streams, so similar to riparian buffer, but we're specifically targeting stream temperature reductions to improve, dissolved oxygen levels, improved habitat for fish, increasing riparian buffer widths. So, whereas in EQIP, we might plant a riparian buffer where there none exists, this would be enhancing it to meet better wildlife habitat stands, since rather than just the minimum width for water quality, say. And then tree and shrub planting for wildlife food, that's fairly broad, but some way enhancing those productions. So adding things like oaks, adding things, maybe hazelnuts or winter berries, or all kinds of other different species that have a very valuable lean towards wildlife food resources. Then we'll wait for the thing again. There we go. you want me to do this one, Toby? I can't remember what we had said for the process.
Yeah, it's up to you. Yeah, it's fine. You can go ahead if you want.
I can start it off. So,
Okay.
in general, you're going to contact a landowner. In general, is either going to contact an NRCS field office to request assistance, like Toby has here, and or sometimes folks just directly contact us as the partners as well too. Sometimes. So I get a lot of calls as well directly from folks that are interested, and I might go out as well too beforehand. But you typically are going to meet with NRCS staff and a partner like myself for forestry and wildlife. If you're in the southwestern part of the state in Addison County, it'll be me. If you're in other parts, it'll be one of my colleagues. To kind of get what your objectives are, what resource concerns there are we can address, and then inventory all that stuff for an application. Um, then after that point, we're going to develop that conservation plan to say, here's exactly kind of what we want to address. Here's how we're going to do it. And this is the plan going forward. And then after that's agreed upon, we get to the plan where it's going to be assessed, ranked with all of the different other projects that are statewide. That's all done by the NRCS staff with help from us to help answer those ranking criteria as well too. And then, unless you have anything to add to it,
No, that's fine. Do you want me to
and
do
then
this?
depending on where that assessment goes, oops, sorry. Depending on where that assessment ends up in the ranking, we're going to determine which pool makes more sense. Like I said, like Toby said before, if you're just starting out or you have a lot of things to do, equip usually is the better option, whereas CSP is kind of those later, more enhancing type things. So we after assessment and ranking is done, if you're selected for funding, the field office for NRCS that's in your area will create a contract from that conservation plan that they'll sit down and go through with you, and then you will sign off on. It'll have a conservation plan map that shows the location and all the extent of the practices, and it'll also include that schedule of operations to follow through with that contract. So that's going to be all those practices. We're going to agree. Here's kind of the schedule that makes sense over the length of that contract's life as to how things should get done. And that's what you'll kind of follow as you go forward. And then after all that stuff, so after you have a contract finally, NRCS or the partners like myself will come out. We're going to work with you and any contractors that you hire to get those practices completed. There are going to be certain things that a landowner may not be able to do themselves. For instance, use of herbicide to treat invasive plants is something you have to have a licensed contractor in the state do. So that's something that you're probably going to hire somebody to do most likely. We're going to help you lay out those practices and work with any contractors. We're going to have those implementation requirements developed and reviewed with you and the contractor before each activity is commenced usually. Like I said, we're going to lay that out flat with either flagging or paint or however makes the most sense. And then once it's completed, NRCS or one of us partners is going to come out to certify that the practice meets NRCS's standards for the contract so that it's done to what the standard is that we agreed upon prior, as this is where we want to get to for that habitat element or that forest health element, and make sure. And then after that happens, then you get to the payment process for that practice.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in here for a sec, Travis. And that's direct deposit. It goes to your bank account. That's set up ahead of time. But I also wanted to mention, I kind of neglected to mention this. We have NRCS foresters in the field offices now in a few places. So our state conservationist, Travis Thomason, when he first came here, I'm not sure if it's a year, I'm drawing a blank. It's recent, relatively recently. He was very surprised that we didn't have more foresters for a state that's primarily forested. So he was able to hire 3 foresters. We've lost one, but we do have 2 foresters still in the state at the local field office level. Sean Rabbit is in Berlin, covering the central part of the state, and Chris Evans is in the northern part of the state. And then, of course, Spencer Como is our National Wild Turkey Federation forester covering the southern part. So besides fish and wildlife, you may have interaction with some of these other folks out in the field as well. So I just wanted to touch on that. So I'm going to take it again here for a sec. I did want to let folks know about these partnership initiatives that we have. The Working Lands for Wildlife was developed kind of jointly between NRCS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to address at-risk species. So species that were candidates for listing to the Endangered Species Act. The idea is to get conservation going for these species before they're listed and to hopefully keep them from being listed. And that's kind of the whole point of this. And so the one that we have a few in the state, and I just want to touch on these briefly. One is the Northeast turtles. And for us, there's three turtles, but the focus for us in Vermont is the wood turtle. This is a turtle that lives in streams for the most part. These are kind of low gradient, meandering streams with point bars. And they travel a good distance so to feed and to breed in some cases, looking for sand or gravel to nest in. So there can be a lot of hazards, with agriculture, with roads. So this is a species of conservation need, and we're focusing efforts on this. And if you're in an area that you have a stream like this, reach out to NRCS or maybe something that we can do to help conserve this species. Similarly, there's a New England Pollinator Partnership. While it's not a Working Lands for Wildlife, it's built exactly the same way. When we participated in this and developed this, Working Lands for Wildlife was not accepting new projects, but we built it the same way and it has the same functions. So basically this was done to address some of the at-risk species, the bumblebees and the monarch butterfly. And for folks that are interested in doing conservation work, specifically for pollinators, you can participate in this effort. Just need to follow our best management practices for your conservation plan, and can do a lot of different activities, practices through various programs. It's not tied to one program or another, but it's a really good effort as well for pollinators. And the last one I just wanted to touch on briefly was a golden wing warbler. This is a national Working Lands for Wildlife effort, and it's primarily in the Champlain Valley. And it's focused around young forest with retention of overstory trees. The species is pretty picky about the habitat it likes, and so this is something that we're starting to work on here in the state. And if you're in this area and you have some areas, old fields and forests that may need some work, maybe reach out to NRCS and see if this might be a good fit for your land. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Felixia. She can introduce herself and take it from here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Good afternoon. My name is Felixia Moore, as Toby mentioned. I'm currently acting as a state resource conservationist for NRCS Vermont, but on my regular day-to-day life, I'm the district conservationist for the southern region, covering Rutland, Bennington, Windham, and Windsor counties. And so, what we're talking about here, you may have heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act funds that are coming through or that have already arrived, like IRA. What does that even look like? There's special funds, and I want to be able to take advantage of those special funds. And so, these special funds through the Inflation Reduction Act are actually tied to the programs that Toby and Travis have already mentioned. So the CSP, the EQIP program, Inflation Reduction Act funds are already tied within those. They just have their own fund pools within our states. And so the key thing about them, though, is that they're tied to what we call these climate smart agriculture and forestry mitigation activities. And that's what you're seeing on the screen right now is a list of approved activities, practices, and enhancements, EQIP and CSP, that is expected to result in greenhouse gas emission reduction or the removal within a given scope as supported by the scientific literature. And so you'll see some examples there on this list. You'll see the mitigation categories. They're broken into categories where you'll see soil health, there's wild forestry and wildlife, there's grazing. You'll see the practice code. The practice code is in association to the conservation practices, like Toby mentioned within equip. And then you'll see the second code where it says an E in front of it. That represents the enhancements that are associated with the practice code. And those enhancements are usually under our CSP program. Next slide, Toby. And so when we talk about these funding sources, there are different funding pools for this Inflation Reduction Act. And so these practices that we're talking about today are usually within the forestry upland habitat funding pool with Inflation Reduction Act funds. And so those are lists of kind of the practices that have already been mentioned and the enhancements associated with them. Next slide, Toby. And so Farm Bill timelines, our FY24 is already rolling. We're already in the midst of ranking, assessing, ranking, and then preparing to send out pre-approvals for applications that met our October um, 20th timeline last fall. And so any applications after that, if they were not included as a part of the CSP round two, which was a March 29th um, application consideration cutoff, or the organic transition, which was March 1st, then those applications will, if they did not fall into those categories, they're being considered for FY25 funding with planning happening right now up until that time frame. We're looking at an August date for FY24 application consideration, and that's allowing opportunity for those folks to apply earlier in the time frame, and then allowing that additional time before snow hits the ground or we're not able to really get out in the field to do the assessments that are needed, um, to fully access and assess and rank these applications. And so for NRCS assistance, it's mentioned before, we work with non-industrial private forest landowners, agricultural land, not town, state, or federal. We work with the Farm Service Agency, which is our sister agencies. Most NRCS offices have um, NRCS and Farm Service Agency representation in those offices, and we work together with them to help establish your eligibility with the land through the tract and parcel boundaries that they map out in their systems that talk to our systems. And so, from a landowner, we're working with the private individuals or the entities who must have control of the land and must meet the FSA eligibility as well. And so you submit an application to NRCS. Although we have those batching periods where we have the application consideration cutoff, we take applications year round anytime. So don't hesitate to apply for those programs. And so the deadlines are set for applying for current fiscal year funds. And then in some cases, another batch of applications may be considered, case in point, the CSP round two for March. And just a reminder that any funds that are provided through NRCS assistance is taxable, so you will receive a 1099 at the end of the year to include in your taxes. And so, depending on where you are, this is a map of our current layout in Vermont as it relates to your service centers. We are broken into what we call zones. So, we have 4 zones: the Northwest Zone, the Northeast Zone, the Central Zone, and the South Zone where I reside. And so, to the left is just kind of a list of your service centers by the county and their contact information, telephone numbers.
And I think that's the
Does it?
end.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know
Well,
how we wanted to do questions. I know there's been a few questions in the chat. I've been kind of answering some questions here and there. Lisa?
Great, thank you all so much. Let's just quick run through if people want to put their questions into the chat. As Felixia said, she had and Travis both had answered some already in there. For those that will be watching us at a later date, I kind of want to go over a few of those ahead of time. So one of it was around, do most practices and enhancements allow for landowner to complete the process in terms of doing the apple tree pruning or doing the invasive control or whatever the practice is? Can they do it themselves, or does it have to be a contractor? I believe it can be either. But it depends on your capabilities, and you have to be able to accomplish it, and it has to be able to be approved by your soil con. Is that all correct?
That's spot on, Lisa. It has to meet our standards and specs. And so, if whether you do it or a contractor does it, as long as it meets our standards and specs. Now, I'll let Toby speak to the invasive piece about that, because some of those where it's chemical, there needs to be some certifications associated with it. So, Toby, if you wanted to speak on that piece, but you're spot on, Lisa.
Yeah, for folks that are hiring out invasive plant control, they need to be working with a certified pesticide applicator with Vermont Ag Food and Markets. We've had some landowners interested in doing their own work, and we ask that they get the core certification from Vermont Agency of Ag just to be safe. We working with herbicides, we don't take it lightly, and we want to make sure people are safe. So
Yeah,
Great.
that's for the that's for the chemical control, just to make sure. There are mechanical options as well too that folks could do themselves or hire a contractor as well too.
Great. There was someone who asked if this, and I know you mentioned it earlier, but it bears repeating. If you're in UVA or what's known as the current use program, these practices can be implemented while you're enrolled in that program. They are not contrary to it. You may have to do an amendment to your forest management plan, but other than that, it's fine to use both the programs together to be able to get the habitat work done that might be recommended in your forest management plan that you registered with UVA. So they are compatible programs. So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. Just need to get with the county forester and see what kind of documentation they need. It can be different from county to county a little bit. So just making sure that somebody connects with that local county forester for their parcel.
Great. Is there a minimum acreage for doing practices or enrollment or having a forest management plan?
NRCS does not discriminate against any acreage size. Now, that may be different when you're working with some of the state programs, but from an NRCS standpoint, we don't have an acre minimum.
Another question is, does the discussion have to start with the parcel or with the practice? So does the landowner have to have specific practices in mind, or can they reach out with general restoration intent for a given parcel and say, hey, come see, what can I do? What can I qualify for?
Yeah, so the landowner can just reach out with general restoration. What we like to do is the landowner can reach out and say, "Hey, I'm interested. Um, can you come out and look at my property?" And so in that part, we begin the conversation where we have the soil conservationists, we have the folks like Toby and Travis go out and schedule that site visit with the landowner to kind of walk the land and identify those resource concerns. That's part of that conservation planning piece. And during that time, the landowner can share what their objectives are, and they can specify those things. And then the planner and the forester can walk through that process and identify, hey, these are some of the practices that we can implement as a part of that to address those resource concerns. And sometimes there are practices that the landowner knows, and there are some practices that the landowner does not know. Also, thinking about the forest management plan. So, if it's forest land, the forest management plan is a key piece in that as well. If there's already a forest management plan in place, we'd like to see what that forest management plan looks like, what's all planned there, and then kind of talk about that as well. Travis and Toby, if you want to add to that a little bit too.
Yeah, yeah. I want to add to that. The consulting forester that you may have for your property, if you already have a forest management plan, can play a variety of different roles. So it's kind of up to the landowner, but usually they're very helpful in being able to help plan these practices on the property. They usually, a lot of times foresters will bring to us these properties and what they think what might be a good fit to try to apply for funding for. So just keep that in mind, that your own consulting forester can be helpful in that as well too. But obviously there are some bits with that where, if you have a consulting forester, you're paying that person. We don't want to take away any of that relationship or that business from folks or anything like that. But we will work directly with your consulting forester, if you already have one, to try to make the best plan work for you.
And I'll also add that if a landowner does not have a forest management plan in place, that is also a possibility to do through NRCS as well to help get someone to develop a forest management plan for you. And we consider that a what we call a CPA and DIA, so conservation practice activities, planning activities. Sorry, that we help fund as well.
So one more question. If we put practices into an application, if I have more practices on my property, does that improve my opportunity to get ranked higher in terms of maybe getting funding?
That's always the question, right? Um, what we what I'll say, and I'll think about this carefully. It doesn't mean that you will have a better chance of getting funding if you just stack practices. What we want to make sure that is happening is that it's good conservation planning to where you're addressing the resource concerns and not creating resource concerns, and that the conservation practices are applicable to the land. There are different ways of funding. I know that in the past that there have been worries about not getting funded and not being able to rank high enough for funding. What I will say is that having the Inflation Reduction Act funds and CSAF practices associated will assist in that. There's also the local fund pool efforts from the locally led conservation districts that are creating local fund pools to where producers are not actually having to compete on a statewide basis, but at a local level within their conservation district areas or county areas. And if there's a priority for forest land, then that is taken into consideration and it has a better chance of being funded within those local areas as well. And the planners will um, rank and assess the applicant in any of the applicable fund pools for a better chance of funding, unless the applicant says otherwise that they don't want to be within a particular fund pool. But we're looking at planning, assessing, and ranking in the applicable fund pools. Just a plug, if you have not connected with your conservation district to talk about these locally led processes or local work group to provide that feedback, I do encourage you to connect with them in those efforts for locally led conservation for those local fund pools.
Okay, great. Two more quick questions because we already rounded at one, but one is that there are some practices that don't require a forest management plan. For example, if I wanted to golden wing warbler work, would I require a forest management plan for funding? And the second one is if I want to partner with my neighbors and, for example, treat invasives on common property, can we do one application as a group, even if it's not one parcel, it's like 3 combined parcels? And those are the last questions I'm asking.
I can take the first one. I was just actually typing that. Wherever a practice through EQIP is being applied in forest land, onto forest land, there needs to be a forest management plan in place. So or a good deal of the practices for golden wing warbler EQIP, working lands for wildlife, will be on forest land. So it would require a forest management plan being in place. And what was the second question? Had to do with
Aggregated land. So if I'm going to partner
yeah.
with my neighbors, can I get funding or does it have to only be on like my personal parcel?
Maybe Felixia, you can talk about
Yeah,
that, control land
yeah.
and such.
Right. So unless there is a lease agreement or an entity that includes all of the neighbors together, you would have to apply separately, but you can apply separately for the same things and let the planner know, and that planner can work with all of you together to devise that plan with hopes that you would all essentially get funded together, right? But it would have to be separate applications in order to get that done, unless you all are an entity together.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today over this noon talk. If you're a landowner out there listening, contact the NRCS or a habitat biologist, have them walk your land. Like Travis said, they love being out in the field and looking at what this is going to do on the ground or what it can do on the ground on your property. If you would like to see some of these practices implemented, on April 13th in Brandon at Wolf Forest, we are hosting, it's a coverage cooperator, Len Schmidt's property. He's hosting NRCS, Soil Conservation, Olivia Carlson and Travis will be there talking about and showcasing. He has like 6 different practices he's either implementing or implemented on his property. And so he will be showcasing some of those, and it's a great one. If you haven't signed up for our e-news, go ahead and do that, and you'll find the information on how to register for that. Also coming up on Wednesday is our Be Tick Safe in Vermont. As we said, ticks are already out because of our warming weather already, so you may want to watch that. So while you're out in your woods, you are tick smart. Again, thank you, Toby, Travis, and Felixia. We really enjoyed this afternoon. If anybody has any questions, Toby had put his email in the chat, and I will follow up with everyone's email when I send out the recording. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.